Good morning, everyone. Firstly, can I just thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak to you this morning. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be able to do so, and thank you for the introduction. I hope to be able, through this presentation, to give you some insight into the contribution of the Inspectorate in England to improving schools in England, and also some a flavour of the contemporary issues which surround the role of the Inspectorate in England in what is in England a very rapidly changing environment in which schools are operating. As you'll probably hear later, an environment in which many schools are operating increasingly independently of the state. Firstly, my background is I'm one of Her Majesty's inspectors, which always amuses my children. They assume that I have a tea on a regular basis with the Queen. Sadly, that's not the case. But I also work within Ofsted, in a department of Ofsted which looks at the use of our evidence, our information that we get from inspection to understand more about the school system and school improvement within England. So I have those two roles, but the day job is very much being in schools, inspecting and evaluating the quality of education. A little bit of background, which I think perhaps we've already touched on. It's important to understand that Ofsted as an organisation is fully independent of the Ministry of Education of the state. That's, I think, part of the reason why the label of Her Majesty's Inspector has persisted over the years, to make clear the role that as civil servants we are independent of government. It matters not who is currently the government in the United Kingdom. We've had a change of government very recently, and the civil service carries on despite that. And at times we are able to have quite challenging conversations with the Ministry of Education. One of the things we say is we inspect without fear or favour. So we don't promote a point of view, and nor do we shy away when there are difficult things to be said. That diagram illustrates that difference. So Parliament and government in one part of the diagram, and Ofsted in a completely separate part of the diagram. Legislation requires us to report our findings to government, but our role and our activity is not dictated by ministers. We had a little bit of a history lesson at the start. Well, another history lesson now. The role of the Inspectorate in England goes back to the 1830s, so some 180 years. And at that time, as we heard earlier on, the inspections of schools were really the inspections of factories, where children received up to 2 hours of education every day. At that time, the quality of education wasn't what was being looked at. It was whether or not children were actually, or factories were sticking to what they were expected to do. By 1840, there was a more formalised system for inspecting schools, and professional inspectors came into being. Many of the things that were put in place in 1840 persist today, including the fact we must report every year to Parliament. Well, the purpose of school inspections covers a lot of areas, some of which we've heard about this morning as well. A key role of Ofsted is to provide impartial guidance to parents who must make choices about schools for their children. We provide information about schools, we check on minimum standards, and we give confidence in the use of public money, something that stretches back to the 1840s. And crucially, we promote the improvement of individual schools and the system of education nationally as a whole. Many studies have been undertaken to look into the effectiveness of external evaluation of schools. This study from 2013 makes clear the OECD's view that external monitoring and evaluation of schools is central to their improvement. And clearly, within the Inspectorate, we would share that perspective. If I tell you a little bit about how the inspection system works within England so that you understand the context, as was mentioned at the start, all of our activity is made available publicly. So when we inspect a school, the outcome of that inspection, an inspection report, is made available to anyone who wishes to look at that. In fact, it's a legal requirement for schools to provide the inspection report to the parents of children who attend that school. This is an example of a recent inspection report. You will notice I've highlighted in the smaller box, but we grade schools according to their effectiveness. And we have a set of standards, which I'll come to later, for doing that. We have a 4-point grading scale. Grade 1 is the highest. We call those schools outstanding schools, and they're currently about 20% of schools in England are outstanding schools. Grade 2 schools are good schools, and currently around 60% of schools, another 60% of schools are good schools, and then grades 3 and 4 are for weaker, less effective schools. Grade 3 schools make up about a further 15 to 16, 17%, and a very small number, grade 4, which we regard as very weak schools or inadequate schools, are about 2 or 3% of all schools in the country. Recently, we've adapted our approach to our reports to emphasise what the school needs to do to improve. So on the first page of the report, it is always made clear in one section why the school isn't, if it's not a grade 1 school, why it isn't yet a better school. And this is considered to be an important emphasis, that the reporting process makes clear to schools how they can improve. And we try and report that in ways which are accessible to the parents of the children at the school as well. Within the report, we also try to make clear specific recommendations that schools should follow in order to improve. This has been the source of some recent debate within England, and some bodies within England, for example the teaching unions, are concerned that sometimes, as an inspectorate, we may suggest to schools how to improve in ways they would see as too prescriptive, in ways which could be interpreted as requiring very specific courses of action. Now, this is a tension in England at the moment, to which we are considering the best ways of adapting our approach. I mentioned that Ofsted's required to report every year to Parliament. This was the report from 2 years ago. And every year we look at our inspection evidence from the many thousands of inspections that take place in the course of the year, and we report back our main findings to Parliament. So in this way, we are able to influence policymakers and influence thinking about the contemporary picture of education within England. I'll come to two specific examples of that in a moment. For example, based on our inspection evidence, this is an interesting slide which always interests school managers. Here we've looked at the evidence from 114 schools that were judged as grade 4. That's our very weakest schools. Our evidence shows us, or suggests, that actually the biggest factor in those schools not improving is not the quality of teaching per se, but the quality of the leadership of teaching. That is, how effectively leaders and managers are able to improve the quality of teaching within their schools. As I mentioned, we also undertake a series of work designed to look at specific issues, and on the left is a report where we've looked at the most able children, those children with who've shown the greatest potential. And there's a debate in England currently whether those children achieve as well as they could. On the right is a long-running issue to do with the performance of children from disadvantaged or poor backgrounds. And within England, there's been considerable emphasis on providing or influencing policymakers to consider the needs of that group of children in more detail. So, for example, from our inspection findings, we are able to try to understand the patterns of teaching which are less effective, for example, for more able children. So we are able, through our work, to help schools to diagnose how their work might be improved for specific groups of children. As I mentioned, we have a set of national standards that inspectors use when they are inspecting schools, and those are available to all schools to see. So it's a transparent process, or as transparent as we can make it. This brings with it some potential side effects, which I will talk about in a moment, and some of the things that we are doing within our contemporary thinking to consider ways in which we might reduce the impact and consequences of the side effects of inspection. But how does inspection support school improvement? Well, set out in legislation, it raises expectations, as I said, by setting standards. It provides challenge where improvement is needed and helps to identify strengths and weaknesses. It recommends priorities for the schools, and where it's necessary, we check and promote subsequent progress. A key focus, though, and I was interested to hear it mentioned in one of the contributions this morning, is that we've placed a strong emphasis on increasingly encouraging schools to improve the quality of their self-evaluation, their self-diagnosis. And that's been a central element of school inspection for quite some time within England. In England, schools are increasingly operating autonomously from the state and free, in some cases, to set their own curriculum and to adopt practices they believe most appropriate to their contexts. This places even greater emphasis on the importance of the school to accurately evaluate its own effectiveness. And schools are beginning to work together to undertake increasing processes of self and peer review. So schools not just reflecting on their own effectiveness, but working with other similar schools to check each other's effectiveness. In that context, the role of the inspectorate to set national standards has an interesting dimension, and it's one that we're clearly developing as this new structural setup within England becomes established. Just want to touch briefly on a small amount of evidence of the impact of inspection. What's become clear from our own work is that where the inspection or the inspectorate is able to make a contribution, that is when the school understands clearly why inspectors have come to certain judgments and what they need to improve. Now, we've undertaken some interesting work talking to schools about inspection. And the interesting finding from that often is that what schools value about inspection is talking to inspectors, dialogue with inspectors, a professional discussion about school improvement with inspectors. Sometimes I wonder about that discussion, though, because there is a potential side effect in that discussion has the potential to be about inspection and not about school improvement, although those two things quite clearly would have much that overlapped. So is that discussion about how schools, or so schools trying to understand how to pass inspection, or is that discussion about genuinely about school improvement? And I think that's a really important debate within England at the moment, and it's one to which we are increasingly endeavouring to make sure that inspection has a force for improvement rather than a force or a focus on measurement. We've done a long-term survey over 5 years asking schools, and they can reply anonymously, about the impact of their inspection. Over the last 5 years, there's been nearly 23,000 responses to Ofsted about the impact of inspection. Generally, it's been overwhelmingly positive. Surprisingly, one might sometimes think. We see here two statistics in which 98% of school leaders and managers believe the inspection was effective in identifying clear recommendations for improvement. 98% also said they would use what the inspectors recommended to help them improve their school. Typically, we get 75% of schools who respond to that survey. So it's a very high proportion and something which we ought to think about in terms of its impact. And interestingly, inspection doesn't need to say something new to have impact. School leaders will often tell us, actually, inspectors validating their decisions or giving confidence to school leaders they were doing the right things was just as valuable as any new insight. As this head teacher here says, inspectors gave confidence to the leadership team that we were taking effective action and validated our judgments, our evidence, and our improvement plans. There is still, in my view, a critical role for the external evaluator of schools, as evidenced, I think, in that school head teacher's viewpoint. We also asked schools 4 months after their inspection, what have you done since inspectors were in school? Perhaps unsurprisingly, their responses, and it's set in this chart, are dominated by, at the bottom, managing and improving teaching. And of course, that is what we would all want. But I did mention about side effects. Here's a newspaper report recently in a national newspaper. This gentleman here actually is Sir Michael Wilshaw, who's Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, my boss, effectively. Not a member of the government, as I mentioned earlier, but a civil servant. The headline asks the question, which I think is really quite an important question in relation to inspection. Are head teachers too caught up in what Ofsted wants? If it's all about striving to please the inspectors, schools will never truly improve. Now, it's intended as a provocative headline, but it nevertheless raises a very genuine point about the role of the inspectors or the inspectorate in promoting school improvement. What does Ofsted want? This question is perhaps the most powerful question in English education. Because we publish our reports and because school leaders see that process as very public, very high stakes, the process or the involvement of Ofsted has the danger to become about pleasing the inspectors rather than simply focusing on school improvement. Now, we have worked hard to refine our approaches to address that issue. I'll try and explain to you how we've done that. we published this document, which is entitled Ofsted Inspections Clarification for Schools. It's an interesting document because it actually says what we're not looking for. Over the years, there's been a cottage industry or a series of whispers, myths about what inspectors would like to see, that sometimes schools feel they need to do just for an inspection. In this document, we state clearly that we don't expect to see those things. And it's addressed as much to teachers as it is to school managers. In theory, it becomes something that teachers can say to a manager, you're asking me to do something simply because it might be for Ofsted, when actually Ofsted are not looking for those things. The heading is really important, and it's something I've said many, many times in similar meetings with school leaders in England. What does Ofsted want? I think this, if you remember one thing from my presentation today, I hope you will remember this. And I say that to school leaders in England as well. Ofsted goes about its business in schools by looking at, not looking for. Let me try and explain what that means. We look at the impact of what the school does on the achievement of children who go to that school. We don't look for the school to be doing particular things. It's for the school leaders, the governors, to decide how the school does something. It is not for the inspectorate to dictate what schools should or should not do. But schools should be able to explain the reasons for their decisions, and then to understand and also to explain the impact of those decisions. So we are putting the onus back on the school and saying, you have the autonomy to do what you like. We are not looking for anything. We're obviously looking for things to do with the safety of children, things that relate to statutory measures that must be in place to make sure children are safe. We're not talking about those things. We are talking about what goes on in the classroom. We're even talking about the curriculum. Those are decisions for schools and school managers to take. They are not decisions for inspectors. So please, if there's one thing I want you to take away, do take away that simple line. The inspectors in England now look at the impact of things and not look for schools to be doing certain things. I'll very quickly run through this. I was struck by, again, an earlier speaker who used a phrase that we use all the time in Ofsted: every child deserves a good school. Now, while nobody would disagree with that, it means we have an issue about what we do with schools who are not yet good. You will remember from my percentages earlier on, that's about 1 in 5 schools in England. What do we do with schools that don't reach that standard, our standard of good or better? This means we have a responsibility to support and help those schools to improve. But at the heart of that is potentially a contradiction. Can the inspectorate also be an improvement agency? Can we suggest approaches and methodologies to schools if at the same time we say we're not looking for you to be doing certain things? In Ofsted, we sometimes describe this paradox as potentially marking our own homework. What I mean by that is, if we suggest to schools that they take certain courses of action, then when we check later, we are checking our own advice. So there is a tension, to my mind, in the role of the inspectorate as an agency for improvement at the same time. And there does need to be a delineation, a demarcation between inspection and improvement. One should lead to the other, but Ofsted needs to be careful about its role as an improvement agency as well as an inspectorate. Having said that, we do work hard with those schools that are grade 3 and grade 4. We visit them regularly. We check on the improvement and the actions they're taking to improve their schools. We report publicly on that process. We try not to tell the school to do certain things, but instead check the impact of what they're doing to improve their schools. We expect all schools to improve to a good school within 2 years. We then inspect them again and we report on our findings. So in the weakest schools, in the grade 4 schools, what happens? Well, a colleague like myself will visit that school every 3 months, checking on progress. These visits are likely to include a much greater level of dialogue. In my experience, the approach of the school in this situation is a much more open approach with the inspectors. The school wants to talk to inspectors about how to improve. It has a vested interest in having that conversation about inspection. And that, in my mind, is where inspection can have its greatest impact, is in that dialogue with schools. We see thousands of schools. We have an enormous understanding of the variety of different ways in which schools approach improvement. It would be perverse not to have that dialogue with schools that want to improve, to learn from that experience. We did in England, I'll just touch on this briefly, I'm conscious of time. We did in England have a situation where grade 3 schools were classified or given the terminology as satisfactory schools. Now, satisfactory has a kind of meaning that suggests good enough, when actually, in many respects, those schools actually were not quite good enough. Now, they had important weaknesses. In 2012, we scrapped the phrase satisfactory and made it into requires improvement, a phrase which emphasises that every school should strive to be a good school. Our experience showed us that in some instances, some schools remained satisfactory schools for 3 or 4 or 5 inspections in a row. So there was no impetus for improvement. Since 2012, our evidence, and it's still early days, our evidence tells us that schools are working much harder to improve because, to put it bluntly, they don't like the label requires improvement. We also work with those schools to help them to improve. I'll just go forward to this chart. In the blue block is the improved. Now, this block is the schools that improved. The blue block is the proportion of schools that used to improve when we used the word satisfactory. Now, we've only got 2 years' worth of data, but in the red block is the improvement rate of schools that are the same schools, but we now call them requires improvement. The early signs are that our involvement and our greater emphasis on those schools has brought about a significant improvement in the rate of improvement of those schools. But can I conclude my contribution this morning, and thank you very much for listening, by just encouraging you to remember that in England we look at what schools do, we don't look for. Thank you.